A night of unexpected encounters. The city buzzed with life, a symphony of neon lights and distant car horns echoing through the streets. Michael Reynolds adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit as he stepped out of his sleek black car, the cold night air biting at his skin. The evening had been filled with handshakes, polite conversations, and strategic alliances at yet another high-profile gala. The kind of event where power played out behind champagne glasses and insincere smiles. Yet despite the success, despite the empire he had built from the ground up, a familiar emptiness settled in his chest. It was an ache he had learned to ignore, until tonight. His driver, accustomed to their usual route, had instinctively started toward his penthouse, but Michael had ordered otherwise. He wasn't in the mood to drown the evening in whiskey or distract himself with another sleepless night of paperwork. Instead, he found himself standing outside a quiet, dimly lit restaurant, one of his own establishments, though not the kind that made headlines. It was a small, cozy bistro tucked away in a less extravagant part of the city, a place known for its warmth rather than its exclusivity. It had been years since he had visited unannounced. Perhaps he wanted to see his business from the ground up, to remind himself of the foundation beneath the skyscrapers of wealth he had built. Or maybe, just maybe, he was searching for something he couldn't quite name. As he stepped inside, the soft glow of ambient lighting wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The scent of fresh bread and simmering spices filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation. A young couple whispered across their candlelit table, an elderly man stirred his coffee absently, and a small group of friends laughed at an inside joke. It was a world away from the ruthless corporate sphere he lived in, a world that felt strangely untouched by the weight of ambition. Michael found a seat near the window, watching as the restaurant moved like a well-rehearsed symphony. The waitstaff glided between tables with effortless efficiency, their faces marked with the practiced smiles of the service industry. But then, his gaze landed on one waitress in particular. She couldn't have been older than 24, her dark hair neatly tied back, her expression focused yet slightly weary. There was something about her, something in the way she moved, carrying plates with a quiet determination, as if the weight of more than just trays rested on her shoulders. And then, it happened. A sharp voice cut through the gentle murmur of the restaurant. "Emily, enough. You've embarrassed this place for the last time." The words silenced the room instantly. Michael turned his head toward the counter, where the waitress, Emily, stood frozen, her face drained of color. The manager, a broad-shouldered man with a hard expression, glared at her, his voice filled with cold authority. I don't understand," Emily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The manager sneered. "Don't play innocent. We caught you stealing from the register." Murmurs rippled through the restaurant, eyes darting between the two figures. Michael narrowed his gaze, something twisting in his chest. He had been in enough boardrooms to recognize when someone was pushing a false narrative. Emily shook her head, her hands trembling as she clutched her notepad. "I never took anything." But the manager wasn't interested in explanations. "The evidence says otherwise. You're fired." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "And trust me, no restaurant in this city will ever hire you again." Michael didn't move, but something inside him did. He had seen desperation before, seen it in the eyes of young entrepreneurs seeking funding, in employees fearful of losing their jobs. But this was different. This was the kind of helplessness that came from knowing the fight was already lost, that no matter how hard you defended yourself, the verdict had already been decided. Emily's lips parted as if she wanted to argue, to plead her case, but the weight of the accusation pinned her in place. The humiliation, the sheer injustice of it all, reflected in her eyes. And that was when Michael did something he hadn't planned. He stood abruptly, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor making the manager pause. All eyes turned to him. The manager's frown deepened. "And who the hell are you?" Michael took a step forward, his presence commanding. "The owner of this place." A hush fell over the restaurant. The manager paled, suddenly realizing the gravity of his mistake. Mr. Reynolds," he stammered, his demeanor shifting instantly. I didn't realize you were." "I don't think you did." Michael cut in, his voice sharp. He turned his gaze to Emily, who looked equally shocked. Then, back to the manager. "Explain." "Now." The manager swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "She was caught taking money from the register. I had no choice but to." "Do you have proof?" Michael's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. The manager hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's what I thought." Emily exhaled sharply, her hands clenched at her sides, as if bracing herself for whatever came next. Michael turned fully toward her, his expression unreadable. "You're not fired." Emily blinked, her breath hitching. I'm not." "No." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to process what had just happened. Disbelief flickered across her face, followed by something else, suspicion. Michael didn't blame her. The manager, still standing there, opened his mouth as if to protest, but Michael cut him off. "You're suspended. Effective immediately." His voice was like steel. "And if I find out you fabricated this accusation," he let the threat hang in the air. The manager nodded quickly, his face pale. Michael then turned back to Emily. "You have a job here for as long as you want it." She didn't say anything right away. And when she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" Michael didn't have an answer. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the quiet strength mixed with exhaustion, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. But as he walked out of the restaurant that night, Emily's face wouldn't leave his mind. And for the first time in years, Michael Reynolds, the ruthless businessman, the man who had built an empire, felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time, a need to understand, because something told him this wasn't just about a false accusation. This was about something much, much bigger, a truth unraveled. Michael Carter sat in his sleek black car, staring at the soft glow of the restaurant's neon sign reflecting on the rain-slick pavement. The city hummed around him, cars rushing by, distant voices mingling with the night air, but his mind was caught in the past. Emily. The name itself felt like a weight in his chest, pressing against something he hadn't confronted in years. He had walked into that restaurant expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, maybe a temporary escape from the sterile world of boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. Instead, he had walked straight into a storm that had shaken him to his core. The accusation against her had been false. He knew at the moment he looked into her eyes, eyes that reminded him of someone he had loved and lost. That feeling, that instinct, had driven him to act without hesitation. And now, sitting alone in his car, he couldn't shake the gnawing curiosity, the unease creeping up his spine. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Ryan," he said, his voice low but steady. His assistant picked up on the first ring, always alert, always efficient. "Yes, sir. I need you to find everything you can on a woman named Emily Thompson. She works at one of our restaurants. I want details, her background, her family, where she grew up, everything." There was a brief pause on the other end. Ryan never asked questions, but Michael could sense the hesitation. "I'll get on it right away," he finally said. Michael ended the call and leaned back against the cool leather seat. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel as memories stirred at the edge of his mind, threatening to break through the carefully built walls he had erected over the years. It wasn't just about Emily. It was about Claire. The only woman who had ever made him believe there could be more to life than ambition. The only woman who had made him feel something real. And the woman he had let slip away. He had tried to move on, to drown himself in work, in success, in building something so powerful that no one could ever take anything away from him again. Yet in the end, what had all of it been for? A life filled with numbers and acquisitions, yet empty when the night came. That young waitress, Emily. She had worn a look that he recognized all too well. That quiet resilience, the way she squared her shoulders against the world, the way her hands trembled for just a second before she forced them steady again. It was the look of someone who had fought too many battles alone. And now, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, he needed to know why. Hours later, Michael stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring out at the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. The whiskey in his hand remained untouched. He wasn't in the mood to drown anything tonight. His phone buzzed. "Sir," Ryan's voice came through, professional as ever, but with a slight edge. "I found something." Michael turned away from the window, his grip tightening around the glass. "Go on." Emily Thompson, 24 years old, grew up in foster care, bounced between homes until she aged out at 18. No criminal record, no history of trouble. She's been working at the restaurant for the last 3 years, living alone in a small apartment in West Loop. Hard worker, keeps to herself. Michael's jaw tightened. Foster care. The weight in his chest grew heavier. Ryan hesitated. "There's more." Michael didn't speak, waiting. Her mother's name was Claire Thompson. The words hit him like a wrecking ball. For a second, he couldn't breathe. Claire. His Claire. Ryan continued speaking, but the words blurred, drowned beneath the sudden rush of memories flooding his mind. Claire, standing in the rain, pleading with him to fight for them. Claire, laughing as she twirled in the middle of an empty street at midnight, completely unafraid of the world. Claire, the one person he had never stopped thinking about, no matter how many years passed. His fingers loosened around the whiskey glass, and for a moment, he thought it might slip. "Michael?" Ryan's voice pulled him back. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Ryan exhaled. "The timelines match. The records confirm it. Michael, Emily Thompson is your daughter." Silence. A long, crushing silence. Michael turned his gaze back to the skyline, but the city lights no longer held his attention. He had spent years chasing control, ensuring that nothing in his life ever fell outside his grasp. Yet here he was, realizing that he had lost something. Someone, without ever knowing she existed. Emily had grown up in the system, without him, without Claire. And he had been here all along, living his life, oblivious to the fact that his own blood was out there, surviving alone. The weight of it was unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice calmer than he felt. "I need confirmation. I can arrange DNA testing," Ryan offered. "No," Michael said sharply. Then, after a pause, he exhaled. "Not yet. I need to see her first." There was another pause, and for once, Ryan didn't immediately respond. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Michael let out a humorless chuckle, running a hand over his face. "No," he admitted, "but I need to do it anyway." The call ended, but Michael didn't move. Emily had no idea who he was, and he had no idea how to tell her. All he knew was that he wasn't going to walk away. Not again. Tomorrow, he would go back to that restaurant, and he would face the truth. Shadows of the past. The next morning, Michael Carter sat at the long oak table in his private study, a cup of untouched black coffee growing cold beside him. He had been up all night, staring at the city from his penthouse, haunted by the revelation that had shattered the walls of his carefully controlled world. Emily Thompson, his daughter. His fingers traced the edge of the thick manila folder lying open before him, filled with neatly compiled documents, her birth certificate, school records, employment history, facts on paper, yet each one carried a weight he wasn't sure how to bear. Claire had been pregnant, and she had never told him. Michael clenched his jaw, his mind spiraling through every possibility. Had she hidden the truth from him deliberately? Had she been scared? Or had she tried to reach out, only to find him too buried in his ambitions to notice? He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. The air inside the restaurant was warm, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. It was early, too early for the usual lunch rush, but Michael knew she would be here. Emily had always been the first one in, according to Ryan's reports. And there she was. She moved through the space with quiet efficiency, her apron tied around her waist, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on setting up for the day. Michael had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar deals, standing toe-to-toe with the most powerful men in the industry, never once faltering. But now, standing mere feet away from his own daughter, he hesitated. She was younger than he had expected. Of course, he knew her age, but seeing her in person made it real in a way the documents never could. She had Claire's features, the sharp cheekbones, the curve of her lips, but her eyes, those were his. When she finally turned and saw him, recognition flickered across her face, but it wasn't the kind he had expected. It was caution. Not fear, not suspicion, just the guarded wariness of someone who had learned to keep people at a distance. "Back again?" she asked, her voice even, professional. Michael nodded. "I wanted to apologize." Emily raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For the way I handled things yesterday." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then she gave a small shrug. "It wasn't your fault. People like Mr. Sullivan see what they want to see." Michael's jaw tightened at the mention of the man who had accused her. He had already made sure Sullivan's business would be suffering an unexpected setback in the coming weeks, but Emily didn't need to know that. She moved to wipe down a table, as if dismissing the conversation. Michael took a step closer. "Emily," he said carefully. She stilled, her grip tightening on the cloth. Something about the way he said her name, like it meant something more, made her look at him again. "I was hoping we could talk," he continued. "Somewhere private." Her expression darkened. "Look, if this is about my job, I appreciate the concern, but I can handle myself." "I know you can." His voice was steady, but inside, he was unraveling. Emily's gaze searched his face now, like she was trying to read something in his expression. After a long pause, she sighed. "Fine. I have a break in 20 minutes. You can wait at that booth." It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. Michael inclined his head, then quietly took a seat. For the first time in his life, waiting felt unbearable. 25 minutes later, Emily slid into the booth across from him, crossing her arms. "All right," she said. "What is this really about?" Michael took a deep breath. He had rehearsed 100 ways to say it, but now that she was in front of him, nothing seemed right. So he went with the truth. "I knew your mother." Emily's expression didn't change, but he saw the way her fingers tensed slightly. "So, I knew her a long time ago," he continued. "We were close." A hollow laugh escaped her lips. "Right. You and every other guy she ever met." Michael flinched. The bitterness in her voice wasn't just skepticism, it was pain. "She never mentioned me?" he asked quietly. Emily's eyes flickered with something, hesitation, maybe doubt. Then she shook her head. "No. And if you're here because you feel guilty about some old fling, don't bother. She's been dead for years." Michael felt the words like a blow to the chest. He had suspected as much. If Claire had been alive, he would have found her. But hearing it confirmed, knowing he would never get the chance to ask her why, made the loss feel fresh all over again. "How did she die?" he asked, his voice tight. Emily frowned. "Why do you care?" "Because I loved her. Because I never stopped thinking about her. Because she never told me we had a daughter." He swallowed all of it down and said instead, "Because I should have been there." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, well, you weren't. And neither was my father." The words cut deep, even though she didn't yet realize the truth behind them. Michael hesitated for only a second before saying, "Emily, I am your father." The world seemed to stop. For a moment, she just stared at him, like she hadn't heard him right. Then, slowly, she laughed. Not the reaction he had expected. "That's not funny," she said, shaking her head. "It's not a joke." His voice was steady, unwavering. Emily scoffed. "Yeah, right. My father ran off before I was even born. My mom never even said his name. So whatever game you're playing." "I didn't know," Michael interrupted, his voice raw now. "Claire never told me she was pregnant. I only found out yesterday." Emily's lips parted slightly, but she quickly schooled her expression back into something unreadable. "You're lying." "I wish I were." She shook her head again, but this time there was less certainty in the movement. Michael reached into his pocket and slid a folded photograph onto the table. It was old, slightly worn at the edges, a picture of him and Claire years ago in another lifetime. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up. She looked at the photo, then at him. And for the first time since he walked into that restaurant, he saw something other than guarded suspicion in her eyes. He saw doubt. He saw fear. And maybe, just maybe, the smallest flicker of hope. A name in the silence. For the longest time, Emily said nothing. She just sat there, staring at the photograph as if it held the power to rewrite her past. Michael didn't push. He knew better than anyone that words meant little when the weight of truth pressed down on you. Instead, he let the silence settle, filling the space between them like an ocean neither of them knew how to cross. Finally, she exhaled a shaky breath. "I need to go." She placed the photograph back on the table and stood up too quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. Michael wanted to stop her, to say something that would make this easier, but there were no right words for a moment like this. "Emily." His voice was softer now, almost unsure. She paused, but only for a fraction of a second, before shaking her head. "I can't do this right now." Then she turned and walked away. Michael let her go. Days passed, then a week. He didn't return to the restaurant. He didn't send someone to find her. For the first time in his life, Michael Carter waited. Not for a business deal, not for a calculated move, for his daughter. And then, one evening, when the city was beginning to settle under the weight of dusk, the elevator to his penthouse chimed. He hadn't been expecting anyone. When he opened the door, Emily stood there. She looked different, not in any drastic way, but something about her posture, the way she held herself, was less defensive now. She held a folded piece of paper in her hands. "My mom never talked about him," she said quietly. "But once, when I was little, I heard her say a name." Michael didn't breathe. Emily swallowed, then looked him in the eyes. "It was yours." Then she handed him the paper. For the first time in his life, Michael Carter hesitated before taking something. His fingers brushed the worn edges as he unfolded it. It was a letter. Claire's handwriting, slightly faded, but unmistakable. He didn't read it right away. Instead, he looked at Emily, the daughter he never knew he had, the one person in the world who had every reason to walk away from him. And yet, she was here. Not ready to forgive. Not ready to trust. But here. And for Michael, that was more than he had ever dared to hope for. As the city hummed below, Michael sat down, unfolded the letter, and read the words Claire had left behind. By the time he reached the end, his vision blurred. Not from grief, not from regret, but because, in the last line, she had written something he never thought he would hear from her again. His name. A name in the silence. A whisper from the past. A second chance. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.